Salutations, sports fans! Get set for a furious fandango of football. This is Sunny Day along with the BFL's all-time leader in career-threatening injuries, Chuck Downfield.
Thanks, Sonny, but you can call me Chuck.
Hang on to your helmets, sports fans, because we've got a heck of a game heading your way. Reporting from a rainy Phillips Field, the TD Rexes and the Rowdy Roosters.
Let me just remind everyone that this portion of today's broadcast is being brought to you by the fine folks at Big Boys Underpants. Now with extra elastic.
Well, let's get this show on the road. Here's the kick.
Wow. Wow, 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 wow.
First down and 20, 40-yard line.
14, 15, 55. Hut.
Looks like they're going to the air here. The QB runs with it, going to the air.
Wow, 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 wow.
Second
one.
down and a
Hut
ways
two.
to go. 40-yard line.
Hut.
Long drop. Roll out.
That's some blocking.
Third down here for the TD Rexes.
Wow, 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 wow.
Third
Hut
down,
one. Hut two.
49-yard line.
Hut.
The QB runs with it.
That defense was all over them like chicken pox.
Wow, 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 wow.
Fourth down and 45-yard line. Looking for the open receiver. Brian Urlacher passes it.
Wow, 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 wow.
First down and 20, 45-yard line. Back to throw. Sacked by
Whammo! They really stuck him that time.
Wow, wow, wow.
second down and a ways to go. 34-yard line. Dante Rupp, Reese Worthington. Caught it. Dragged down.
Wow, wow, wow. Wow, wow, wow.
Third and 46-yard line. Looking to throw. Sacked.
You have to rely on your defensive backs to come up with a big play.
Wow, 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 wow. Wow, wow.
Fourth and long.
Let's go.
31-yard line. Booms one. Picked up by Zach Thomas. Fumble.
You gotta like a defense that can use their hands like that.
wow, 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 wow.
First down and 20, 32-yard line.
It looks like the ball carrier caught
The quarterback goes down and goes down hard. Dropped for a loss.
Wow, 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 wow.
Second and long, 43-yard line. Dante Robinson, Brian Urlacher was the first to get there.
Wow, 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 wow.
Third and long, 35-yard line. Long drop. The quarterback goes down and goes down hard.
That defense was all over them like chicken pox.
Wow, 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 wow.
Fourth down and a long way to go. 36-yard line. The kick.
Wow, 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 wow.
First
Get
down
set.
and goal.
Hut.
18-yard line. Guns it. Intercepted.
Wow, 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 wow. Wow.
First and 20, 27-yard line. They're going to throw. Sacked by
Contrary to popular belief, Sonny, defense has little to do with an actual fence.
Wow, 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 wow.
second and long. 16-yard line. Sacked. Nowhere to go. Ouch. Tackled for a big loss.
Wow. 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 Wow.
Third down and long. 5-yard line.
The defense just used the old code.
Safety.
Those kids on defense look mean, Sonny. Real mean.
Reese Worthington will kick off.
We can do it. Hey, you're right, team.
Wow.
Here's the kick.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First
You
down and
guys look
20,
ready to
20-yard line.
Hold on, folks. It looks like the defense was just turned to stone. The quarterback must have used that stone cold play. That was the best sacking I've ever seen since I went to the grocery store with my mom.
one.
And boy,
Cut
do
two.
those clerks
Cut.
know how to sack.
Guys.
Great job by the defense.
Wow.
From the
Crank it
35,
up.
Annie Frazier. Kicks it.
I didn't think they were going to be able to catch that kid.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First down and 20, 49-yard line. Dante Robinson. Pass it. Pulled in. Reese Worthington is brought to the ground after a gain.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First down and goal. 4-yard line. Pablo Sanchez. Slip. It is a touchdown.
That was the right play at the right time.
Wow. 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 Wow.
Where's the hot dog guy? Steak!
Gives it to Pablo Sanchez. Guns it
That is
complete.
not
They
gonna
make
happen
the
again.
2-point conversion.
Es bueno.
Reese Worthington will be starting it off. Booms one.
That kid puts the special in special teams.
First
You
down and
guys look
20,
cut.
27-yard line. Brian Urlacher passes it.
Get
Second
set.
and long, 27-yard line. Going to throw. Rifles a pass.
I don't know who they were throwing that to.
Third
Get
down
set.
and long,
Hut.
27-yard line. Slings it. Annie Frazier catches the ball. Tackled.
Get
Fourth
set.
and 41-yard line. Rollout.
They're playing some hard-nosed football out there.
It is another set of downs. First
Hut,
and 20, 48-yard line.
Hut.
The QB runs with it.
The key to good tackling, Sonny, is the ability to tackle.
Second down. Second
Hut.
and 42-yard line.
Holy mackerel! No one moves that fast. They must be using a turbo boost.
Dragged down. First down and 20, 25-yard line. It will be Brian Urlacher. Six
Way to
points.
go.
With
Man,
number
that
eight.
defense has more holes in it than my dad's socks.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Holy smoke! It's outstanding what that turbo boost can do for you.
They go to the running back again. Annie Frazier will kick it off here. The kick. That's 2 points for
Good
defense,
job.
and they'll get the
I knew
ball
we could
too.
do it. I
Foot
really
touched the
did.
line. From the 35, Reese Worthington.
Just like practice. Come on, guys. We can do it.
Here's the kick.
Okay, we gotta crank it up, guys.
Out of bounds.
That's all right.
Annie Frazier will be doing the kicking. The kick.
Way to
Nice
go,
one.
guys.
No juegan más.
safety.
No
Pushed out of bounds.
No juegan más.
I could cry.
It looks like Reese Worthington kicks it. Applause!
Wow.
Applause! The
I
line.
didn't just see that.
Annie Frazier about to kick off.
Let's get it done.
Booms one.
Nice
2
one.
points for the defense. And
it.
they'll
Yeah.
get the
Good
ball
job.
too.
No
Forced out of
juegan
bounds. Reese Worthington will be doing the kicking. It is up.
Wow.
Score!
Didn't
No es
just see
bueno,
Pushed out
es
of bounds.
bueno.
Annie
All
Frazier
right.
will kick it off here.
Think
All
happy
right.
thoughts.
The kick. The ball is loose. Can they hold on?
Good
Yes,
job.
it's a touchdown.
Boiled owl. No
In the
mercy.
end, the love you take is equal to the love you make, you know.
The defense just used the old Cobbs drop play to force a fumble there.
Howdy ho, football fans! It's halftime. These two teams are really lighting up the scoreboard.
You know, it's like I always say, it's better to be up at halftime than down. It's true. Well, the other team had the chicken pox too. I was the only player on either team to show up that day, so they awarded the game to me by forfeit. Yes, it was another glorious moment in BFL history.
From the 35,
Get up. Where did all these
Think globally. Act locally.
Booms one.
That was a nice return set up by the old flying wedge play.
First and 20, 28-yard line. They're going to throw.
When the quarterback is tackled, Sonny, it usually results in a sack. Those kids on defense look mean, Sonny. Real mean.
Second down and a ways to go. 13-yard line. Dante Robinson passes it.
That's a classic case of taking your eyes off the ball.
Third down and a long way to go. 13-yard line. Slings it. Picked off. As the dust clears, let's see who has the ball. The TD Rexes. First and 20, 30-yard line.
It looks like the defense has a little extra spring in their step today.
The kick.
I'm not sure if the wind caught that one or what, but I think that punt went backwards.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First down and 20, 20-yard line. Going to the air. Interception.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First and 20, 38-yard line. Annie Frazier back for the kick.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First down and 20, 45-yard line. Long drop. Throws it to the flat. Intercepted.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First and 20, 28-yard line. Gets it off.
I didn't think that ball was ever going to come down.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First down and goal. 12-yard line. Looks like they're going to the air here. They go to the air. Picked off.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First down and 20, 20-yard line. The kick.
Good gravy! What a punt!
Wow. 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 Wow.
First down and goal. 4-yard line. Looking for the open receiver. Fired into the flat.
People should be proud of themselves.
Oh, no. Not gonna
If I've
happen
said it
again.
once, I've said it 100 times. You gotta be able to tackle to play defense.
Wow.
Here's the kick.
Oh,
Knocks it
proud.
home.
That kid sure can kick.
Was that our team?
Wow.
Reese
I
Worthington
love all
tees
of
it up.
Whip 'em like cream.
Wow.
Booms one. The TD Rexes recover the ball.
Wow. 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 Wow.
First down and 20, 27-yard line. Rolls out.
These kids are missing tackles all over the place.
Brings up a second down. Second down and 43-yard line. Option play. Fumble, fumble, fumble. Picked up by Tony Del Vecchio. First and 20, 40-yard line. Keeps it on the ground. Ripped up in the backfield. It'll be second down. Second down and long, 41-yard line. Gets it off.
The key to punting is being able to kick the ball.
First down and 20, 32-yard line. Drops back. They go to caught. It's loose. As the dust clears, let's see who has the ball. The Rowdy Roosters. First and 20, 47-yard line.
All I can say is it's gotta be the shoes.
It is up. Not enough. Drops on the 14. First down and 20, 47-yard line. Long drop. Keisha Phillip. Complete to Annie Frazier. Dropped.
This offense is really starting to click now.
First and 20, 22-yard line. The QB runs with it.
That's what they have to do. Make big plays on defense.
Second and 18-yard line. Hands it off.
When you have a defender beat that bad, you'd like to make a big play.
Third down. Third down, 18-yard line. Looking to throw. They send it airmail.
Oh,
They turn the ball over.
Jeez.
First down and 20, 9-yard line. Reese Worthington back for the kick.
That's some punt.
First and 20, 26-yard line. They will keep it on the ground. Fumble Ruski. Picked up by First down and 20, 32-yard line. Drops back to pass. Dante Robinson picked off. First and 20, 39-yard line. Keisha Phillip, Annie Frazier catches the ball. Ball is over the
I
line.
love you guys.
Sign us up for another season. We'll beat them like a bunch of eggs.
Booms one.
That
Well,
was so
that wraps
beautiful.
things up. For Chuck Downfield, I'm Sunny Day. Thanks for watching VFL Football. And remember, always be a good sport. Be a good sport.
Sign
Always.
us up for
So
another
long.
season.
Wow.